Hello there and welcome. In this episode, we're going to continue with our server. As you can see, we have our art that we created in the previous episode. Sometimes you will see these question marks, and that's just because for some reason Linux is not recognizing these characters. I try to fix it, but sometimes they just appear randomly. Maybe with your art, it's not going to happen. So the thing that we want to do today is to actually create a database on our server, because right now we can save information using JSON, right? We can create a JSON file for each device and store user data or any other data that you like. We also connected this to our Unity project so we can get information, we can set information, but this is not an efficient way to work with real projects. If it's a small project or a medium one, this may be enough, but for big projects, especially if you have a lot of players, you don't want to deal with JSON files. So we want to create an actual database. We're going to use MySQL, which is a very popular database. And to make it even easier, we're going to use Docker. Now, if you don't know what Docker is, it's just a way to create these containers that contain all the different things that you need to run a specific program or application, or even a bunch of applications together. Now, again, this is not a tutorial about Docker. You can learn about Docker. It's very useful for many things, but we are going to use Docker in order to make our life a bit easier. So first of all, we need to install Docker on our Linux server. So first of all, we're going to update our entire package manager. So we're going to do sudo yum update y, and this will update the package manager. Let's clear everything. And now we're going to install Docker. So sudo yum install Docker. So now if you see this over here installed, you know that it was installed. Now we can simply wait for a second to make sure that everything is actually done. Let's type clear. Okay, so we can see complete. For some reason, I have it under this UI, so I don't know why we don't see the actual command line. Let's just clear. And now it's here on the top. And the next thing we want to do is just start the Docker service. So now we're still not touching the database. We're still not using the image or the container. We're just starting our Docker service. And because we're starting it as a service, it will always run and it will always start itself when we log in into our server, exactly with our endpoint service. So we don't need to do this each time. We just do this once now that we installed it. So we're going to do sudo systemctl start Docker, and we're going to enable it as well. And another thing that we may want to do is add our user into the Docker group. Now, we talked about this in, I think, the previous episode or one before that. We can still use sudo to do different operations with Docker, but if you don't want to use sudo each time, we can just add our EC2 user into this Docker group, and this will give us permissions for different operations related to Docker. For this, we're going to do sudo and then the name of our user, which is EC2 user. And now we have it inside of the group. The next thing, we just want to make sure that everything is installed correctly. So we're going to do Docker to see the version. And we can see the version and we can see that we have some kind of permission denied, but this may not affect us at all. The important thing is that the service is running. So we can simply do sudo systemctl status Docker, and we can see that it's active and that it's running. Okay, so now we're going to clear this. The next thing we want to do is download the official MySQL Docker image. And when we have this image, we can basically just run it and it will become a running container. And if you don't know about Docker and the difference between an image and a container, an image is like a blueprint and a container is the running instance. So we first have an image, for example, the image for MySQL, but then we can run it, and as soon as it runs, it becomes a container, and a container is the running version of this image. Then we can stop the container, we can duplicate the container, we can pause it, we can do whatever we want with the container. The image is just the blueprint, okay? And to do this, we're going to type in docker pool, and this is the command to download it from the official Docker website. And then we provide the name MySQL, and we can specify the version that we want. We want the latest, so latest, and we press on enter. Now we may get this error just because we did change our user to be a part of the Docker group, but we did not reboot the server, so maybe these changes were not taken into place. If we try to run it with sudo docker pool MySQL latest, we can see that it works, and now it starts downloading this. Some images can be rather large depending on the complexity of the image. For example, if you have several services inside of this container, so it can be large, it can be even several gigabytes. But in our case, it's rather small. And now that everything is completed, we're going to wait a few more seconds until it's clear. So the Docker image for MySQL, the latest version, was downloaded into our folder. So Docker has its own folders where it stores all of these images. And now we can simply run it. But before we run it, we need to build it, because the image is just a blueprint. We need to provide all the different configurations that we want. Otherwise, it won't know how to run. Different images will have different configurations. I'm going to show you what you need exactly for this MySQL image. Now, if you want to see all of your images, you don't have to go to the actual folder. You can simply type in Docker image, Docker images, and again, it may give us an error because we don't have permissions. So again, sudo. When we're going to reset the server, it will probably give us permissions because the group will contain our user. But for now, let's just do sudo docker images. And we can see that these are all of our images. And we have this one MySQL image. And this is the tag, basically the version, because you may have a newer version and you want to know if you're using the newest version. Then you can simply pull and it will update the image. And this is the size, so it's rather big. It's because it contains all of the things that you need for MySQL to run. Now we want to run this image so it will be a running container. Okay, and to do this, we're going to provide different configurations. So I'm going to provide you a link for this entire block of code in the description, and you simply need to change it with your own values. So we're going to paste it here. And this will basically run this container, okay? We're going to provide the MySQL latest container, and it will run it, and it will basically build it, okay? And then it will generate a container that will run, and we can use it. Now, we also provide this flag over here, restart unless stopped, because we want this to always run even when we restart the server. Another thing that we want to provide is the name of this container, because this is the name of the image, but we want to have a name for the container itself because we can create multiple containers with the same base image, right? With the same blueprint. Maybe we want one container to be a test container and then another container that will be a production container. So we can give it different names. We're going to name it MySQL container. And over here, you need to add the root password, the database name, and the user password. And these things will be required when you actually want to connect to the database, right? Because right now we're just setting up the database. Later, we want to access this database and save information into it. So this is like the initial configuration. Now we also have this path over here. This is where the data of our database will be actually stored, because the container is something that is running in real time, right? But when we stop the container, it will basically stop to exist, but we still want our data from the database to be intact, right? So all the data will be stored in something called a volume, and these volumes will be stored inside var, lib, MySQL, and these volumes will be over here. So if you ever want to back them up or restore your information, you can go over here and you will find these volumes. But this flag over here will basically tell this container that you should save the information and get information from this folder. Another thing that we want to provide, and you can also see that it's V for volume. Now we also have P for port, because this will be the port that the service is going to run on. You remember that for our endpoint service, we have port 5001, so we can access the service on this port. For MySQL, we are using this port, so we're going to use this port to connect to this service, okay? Now we want to set all these different passwords, so these will be the default passwords, and to do this, we simply use our arrow keys to go over here. First of all, let's change the password for the user. Let's just do something very simple. Then for the user, so if you press up, it will just change the prompt, right? It will change the command. So don't do this. Just use left or right. For the user, we're just going to give some name, and then we're just going to rename. Well, let's keep the database named My Database. We can name it whatever you want, because you can have multiple databases. So let's just name it, let's keep it at My Database, okay? And the root password will be something like admin1234. So now we are going to press enter. And again, because we don't have permissions, so let's just paste this all over again. Let's add sudo at the beginning. And let's add our passwords. So this is something you only need to do the first time. For the root, we're going to have admin1234. The database will be the same. For our user, we're going to set it to be Mike. And for the user password, Mike1234. Okay, so now we have everything set up. We can basically press enter. And you don't see anything, but it basically created this container, and now the container is running. Now if we type in docker and again sudo docker ps, we can see the list of all the containers that we have. We can see the name, and this is the image that was used for the building of this container. And we also have the status, so it's basically up, it's running, and this is the port that it's on. So we can access this port to access this server, which is basically a MySQL server or service, and we can access it. And this is the name that we gave it, MySQL container. Now we can also stop this container or delete it. But for now, we don't need to delete it because we want to use it, right? But you can create multiple containers using the same base image for different uses. Maybe you want to have access for different applications. So you can do a lot of things. We're just going to stick with what we want to do. But in order to actually access it on port 3306 and to do something with it, we need some kind of script that will have this logic. So I'm going to provide you a script for a database manager, and this will be our way to basically go into this MySQL database and search for data, save data, update data, create tables, and basically everything you can do with the database, okay? Now, before we create this database manager script, we want to make sure that we have the packages that are being used inside of this script. And it's going to use Flask, and we already have Flask installed, so we only need another one, which is the MySQL Python connector, and this is basically a library that allows Python to connect to a MySQL server and do queries and basically everything that we want to do. So we're going to use pip install MySQL connector Python, and it's going to install it. So it was successfully installed, and now we're going to create our database manager. So we're going to do it the same way we created our previous service. For now, we're just going to create a script and run it. Later, we're going to convert it into a service. So you can find a link in the description with the database manager Python script. I'm just going to create a new file. So let's make sure we are in the right place. Let's go into our Unity folder. And over here, we're going to create this new file. So nano, we're going to name it database manager. And we're going to paste the code inside. Okay, and you can see that it will run on port 5000, but we may want to change it. So we may use something different, for example, 5002. And we also need to open this port, you remember, in the settings for the instance. For now, let's just make sure that everything is set up. So basically, the script will first connect to the database. It will create this database, and it will also create a table. So each database can have multiple tables, and each table is basically just a different type of data. So we want to have user data, right? So we are going to make sure that this table is created. We don't want to create this table separately. We want this script to make sure that this table exists. And of course, for other applications, for other projects, you will probably have to create other tables if your structure is different. We are going to have an integer that will be our user ID, right? And also the score, which is also an integer, because this is what we have right now. We have a user ID and we have a user score. You can also add a username or any other user related information, but this is what we have, right? And if we go to our JSON file, we're going to find the same kind of data, an ID and a score. So we're just creating a table using this SQL syntax, and then we're committing it and we're creating it. So we just want to make sure that it does exist, right? And later, we're going to use all of these endpoints the same way we are using them now in our service. We're going to be able to add a user, update a user, get all users, get a user by ID, and this will directly go into our database and it will get this information. So we don't need to go into our JSON files. This system is not even using these JSON files anymore, okay? So this will override this JSON functionality and it will save everything into the database and it will get things from the database. For example, this very simple add user, we're going to use this endpoint add user and we're going to provide two parameters, ID and score, okay? Then it will take both of these parameters and it's going to create a user, insert into users, ID and score, and it will create this new user. Later, we may want to change a few things over here, but for now, this is the base functionality it's going to have. What we need to do is to set the config for the database, okay? So using the keys, we're going to make sure that everything here is correct. So we are running on the local host. So this is basically the local host of this server. If you want to use this script from a different computer and then use your public IP address and access the database, you're probably going to provide different information over here, but we are running this internally and the script itself is also internal. So we're going to use this localhost, okay? And we can also see that it runs locally. So we're going to keep this as it is. We're just going to change the user, the password, and that's it, okay? The database will stay the same because this is the name we gave the database. We did not change it, but we did change the username. So it's going to be Mike, and for you, it's going to be something else. For the password, it's going to be Mike1234. And again, this is just because we are accessing the database using this script. We are not manually accessing the database. Later in the series, I'm going to show you how you can visually access the database and see the different data and see the tables using a different application. And then we're going to be required to input the user and password manually. But because here only the script accesses the database, we're going to provide this information over here. Now, this is obviously not the best way to store data and passwords. You can use environmental variables, right? So you can save your credentials in a more secure way and then just reference them over here. I will probably show you how to do this later, but for now I don't want to spend time on it. So we're just going to keep it over here. Anyway, this server is going to be very secured because you're using Amazon. So people should not be able to access this script and get your information, but this should still not be public like this inside of the script. So later I'm going to show you how to keep your credentials even more secure. For now, we just make sure that everything here is correct. And now we're going to save this. So again, Control X and Y to save and enter. Okay, and now everything was saved, so we can make sure cat. And now we can see that everything was saved. And now we are going to be able to access and do different things with our database. Now, before we actually make this script into some kind of service and we use it in our Unity project, we're just going to make sure that everything is working. So let's just clear everything. So you don't see it because it's at the bottom. I don't know why it is like this. Maybe I'm going to zoom out a bit. Let's just zoom out. Okay, so now you can see it over here. So let's just clear everything. And now we're going to run this database manager script. So ls, we can see it over here, database manager. It's still not a service. We just want to run it. So Python, database manager. So, right, we have Python 3. So this, and then so now we can see that this script is running on port 5002. And again, this script is just a database manager. So it runs on this port, but the database itself is running on another port. So this entire Linux server is one server, but it has different services. So now we have this database manager service, and we also have our MySQL service, which is inside of a container. And we have this simple endpoint service that we're still using. So we have a lot of services, and eventually we're just going to use this database manager that will access the database and it will do different operation. Now, just to make sure that everything is running, we can access our database from the command line, from the URL, and try to add a user, okay? So as we know, we have this get all users endpoint. So we want to get all users. Obviously, right now we don't have any users. Let's just take our public IP, use port 5002 because this is the port the database manager is running on. And we're going to use this get all users endpoint, get all users. Let's go back over here. Let's go to security. and we can see that only this port is running. So we're going to click on the wizard. We're going to click over here, and we're going to add a new rule, inbound rule, because we want to go into our server, right? So add new rule, and we're simply going to add this port and save. Yes, of course, we want to limit this to basically nothing. And now we have this new rule. And now we're going to refresh, and we can see that we get a response, but this array is empty because we don't have any users. Now let's test this. Let's add a user. Obviously, later it's going to happen from our Unity project. We're going to save users, update users. Now we just want to see if it actually goes into our database. So we're going to add user, and we're going to use this add user endpoint. And we need to provide it with two parameters, ID and score. So we're going to do this because we want to start providing parameters. The ID will be something long, but for now it's just going to be, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to add another parameter, which is score. And it will be, let's say, 9,000, if you know the reference. So now we're going to press enter. Oh, of course, this will not work because I forgot something. We are trying to use a post request, right? We're trying to send data to this endpoint, and we cannot do a post request inside the URL bar. We can only do GET requests. This is something you can learn in my API tutorial. I just forgot about it. So in order to test this, eventually everything will happen in our Unity application, so you don't need to worry about this. We just want to test it out, and we cannot add a user, we cannot do a post request from the browser. To do this, I'm going to use Postman. So it's a very popular application that is used to test API calls, to simulate things, and many people that work with APIs on a daily basis use Postman. So this is Postman. We're just going to create a small post request, the same one that we're trying to do. And you can download this application for free and use it. We're just going to go to our, let's say, blank collection. Let's create a new request over here. And now we want to do this post request. And I'm going to paste the entire thing over here. You can see that I have this curl over here. So curl is just a way to post information in this kind of a special format. And it contains the method, which is post, the actual URL, and it also contains the header and also the body of the JSON. Now, we don't need to set it manually. We can simply take this entire thing and paste it over here, right? It's empty. We can paste it inside, and it will automatically set the information. So it will place the body into the body. It will set the header into the header, and the parameters. Well, we don't have parameters because this is a post request. Anyway, this is just for testing. We're just simulating a post request, and now we're going to send. And we basically got this message, user added successfully, okay? If you want to try this yourself, I'm going to provide this entire curl, okay? So let's just go back. This entire curl, you just need to change the IP, your port, and your data, and then you can paste it over here into your Postman application, right? It will be empty when you just start it. You will have nothing over here. It will be like this. So you will simply create a new workspace, and you're going to add this new call. You're going to change it to post, and you're going to paste this entire curl inside, and it will automatically fill everything up, okay? And of course, you can do it by yourself. You can add this to the body. You can add this to the header. And I think this is all. Yes. And then you are going to test it by basically clicking on send. And it's going to give you a success response. And we get this success response because this is what we have in our database manager script, right? Now that we added a new user, we are going to be able to see it using our get all users endpoint. So now we're going to use our get all users endpoint, and we can see that we have one user, and this is the user that we saved. So all of this information is stored inside of our database, and we can see that everything is working. Now you may have a question, why did we not add a port for the actual MySQL container, right? Because it runs on port 3306, and that's just because we don't need to expose the service externally. We don't need to access it from the browser. Everything is happening inside of our server. So this is only for inbound rules. It means that if we want to go into our server and access these ports, but the container is running internally inside of the server, so we don't even need to give special permissions for this port because we're not trying to access the database internally. We are accessing the database manager, right? So we have this port over here, and then the database manager goes and enters into the database and does whatever it needs. So we are not exposing the database into the public, okay? Now you can also see that this happened. I tried this thing over here. Again, this will be blurred because this is my home IP, but this is what we did. We did get from the browser, from the URL bar. We tried to get all users. It was empty. Then we tried to add this, but it failed because we cannot do this from the browser. But then we used a post request from our Postman application, and then we got all the users again, and we saw that everything is fine because we have a new user. Now, it's basically saved inside of the database. Now, if we stop this for a second, we stopped the database script. And if we try to do this again right now, it's not going to work because the script is not running anymore. In the next episode, we're going to change our database Python script into an actual service, the same way we have our simple endpoint, and it will always run, and we don't need to manually start it like we did over here, right? We did Python 3, so we did this to start the script. We don't want to do this each time, so we're just going to make this script into a service the same way we did with the endpoints. And then everything will work. Then we will simply have to replace the logic inside of our Unity application to use the database manager service instead of the simple endpoint service, okay? So instead of going to port 5001, we're going to go to port 5002, and instead of using these endpoints, the ones that we have over here, we're going to use the endpoints that we have over here, the ones that we use right now, to add a user, to update a user, to get all users, to do whatever we want, okay? So we're going to continue with this in the next episode. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, you can let me know in the comment section. Please subscribe if you're not a subscriber. You can also become a member of the channel and get access to our private Discord and get different perks, and just support me and support this channel. And I'll see you next time.